Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And today, I'm going to tell you 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please break into the like button's water supply and fill it with permanent red dye. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At about 8:20 in the morning on June 29th, 2025, an 83-year-old woman named June Baxter shuffled her way down the hallway of her small home in Attleboro, which is a quiet town in eastern England. As she walked, she had to keep one hand on the wall to keep her balance. She was pretty frail these days and also just had a lot of medical problems. But she also really valued her independence, and so she was determined to keep living alone, even if it was kind of risky. So June used to live with her husband and their dog. But about 7 years earlier, her husband had gotten really sick, and so because of that, they'd had to give their dog to their granddaughter because they just couldn't take care of it anymore and also care for him. And then unfortunately, June's husband did pass away, and so she was left all alone. But even though she was, all alone in terms of living in the house by herself, she wasn't completely isolated. Her granddaughter, who she had given the dog to, lived close by and visited a whole bunch, and almost always brought along June's old dog, which June loved. Now, in addition to just being good company, June's granddaughter also regularly made herself available to help June with all sorts of basic things, like, picking up her prescriptions and going grocery shopping for her and, driving her to and from doctor's appointments. Like, she was really available to her. But despite June knowing that, knowing she could always call on her, she tried hard not to call on her granddaughter, because again, she just really liked being independent. So on this particular day, she, continued slowly walking down the hallway, guiding herself by holding onto the wall, and then she turned the corner to go to the bathroom. And when she stepped inside, she slipped on the tile. And as she was falling to the ground, her leg scraped the corner of the bathroom counter. Immediately, June's leg started bleeding and June's yelling out in pain, but she lives alone, nobody can hear her. And so June quickly went from, just reacting to the pain and the blood. June was scared. I mean, this is the exact scenario that she was so worried about, getting hurt when she was all alone, because she didn't really have a plan. It was like, I'm gonna live alone, so help me. But fortunately for June, she had installed throughout her house all these emergency call bells that would allow her to basically, hit the bell, and they were programmed to contact both her granddaughter and also the local emergency services. And in the bathroom, there was one of these bells. And so once she kind of composed herself a little bit, grabbed the string for this bell, and she pulled it. About 10 minutes later, June was still in the bathroom on the ground, holding onto her leg wound, when she heard the front door of her house swing open. And immediately she heard the sound of her granddaughter calling out for her. And June, as best as she could, even though her voice was a little bit weak, she called out and said where she was. A moment later, June's granddaughter, along with June's old dog she'd brought along, came bombing around the corner, and they looked into the bathroom and they saw, June and her horrible leg wound, and clearly the granddaughter is really worried right away. I mean, this was a very bad cut. But, for June, she's looking at her granddaughter and she's just flooded with relief because she knows no matter how bad this is, her granddaughter is here, everything's fine, and also her dog was here, which made everything better already. And so while June's granddaughter began rummaging through the bathroom to look for some bandages, June just kind of relaxed and just began petting her dog, who was clearly very worried about June. This is her dog previously. They had a very strong bond. And so she's just petting her dog, and then, June's granddaughter did find some bandages, and she wrapped up June's leg. And then by the time the paramedics got there, June actually was feeling basically okay. I mean, her leg definitely hurt, but she was very calm at this point. A couple of minutes later, the paramedics arrived, and by this point, June was actually feeling basically back to normal. I mean, her leg definitely still hurt, but again, her granddaughter had put that dressing on it and basically stopped the bleeding, and also June has her dog that she's petting, like her comfort animal. And so she was very calm. Paramedics come in and they assess her and they take off the dressing to check the wound. And after they cleaned it, they said, look, this is a pretty minor cut. You don't even need stitches. I think you're okay, just be careful and maybe have your granddaughter stay here for a little bit just to make sure you don't fall again, but you're okay, like we're gonna go. And so June, she thanked the paramedics as they walked out the door, and then she and her granddaughter and the dog just sort of sat there feeling grateful that this fall wasn't more serious. However, the next morning when June woke up, she knew something was wrong because, all she's doing is laying in bed, but her heart is racing, she's sweating, she's lightheaded, like clearly something is off here. Now, the day before, after the paramedics left, her granddaughter did stick around for a little bit, but really, June was okay, and so June was alone. And that night, she had some soreness around the cut, but it really wasn't that serious. She really felt like dodged a bullet there. But now, 12 hours later, something's going on here. Now, June had no way of knowing if her current symptoms were indeed connected to her, minor cut on her leg. But her concern that maybe this was serious and could potentially spiral really quickly made her not pull on one of those emergency bells, but instead she just picked up the phone and called an ambulance to take her to the hospital. When she got to the hospital, doctors immediately began running all these tests on her. And very quickly, they determined that she did have a very severe bacterial infection, which she must have gotten after cutting her leg. And unfortunately, that infection had already spread into her blood, which would explain why she was feeling sweaty and lightheaded and why her heart was racing. Now, the medical staff definitely had some questions, like how in the world could this have developed so quickly, especially after the paramedics the day before had, at least according to them, properly cleaned this wound before they left. But, their issue now was not how did this happen, but instead just stabilize June, treat her. And so right away, they began treating June with general antibiotics to try to fight off this infection. But it just wasn't working. And June was 83 and already in relatively poor health, and her condition was clearly deteriorating rapidly. So the doctors began running more tests to try to determine exactly what type of bacteria was causing this infection. Because if they knew that, they might be able to give her more targeted treatment than just general antibiotics, which clearly were not working. And they did eventually identify this bacteria. But by the time they did, June had unfortunately already developed sepsis, which is a life-threatening condition that occurs when a person's body tries so hard to fight off an infection that it basically ends up damaging their vital organs in the process. Medical staff did everything they could, but it wasn't enough. And so eventually, 1 week after going to the hospital, June passed away. It would turn out the deadly bacteria that found its way into June's open wound was introduced to her by her granddaughter, completely by accident. The bacteria is called Pasteurella multicida, and it's found in a very specific place, inside the mouths of domestic dogs. While June laid on the bathroom floor waiting for her granddaughter to find bandages to wrap up her leg, June's old beloved dog, who her granddaughter had brought over, was trying to comfort June, and June was allowing the dog to do that. But what the dog was actually doing to comfort June, was licking her open wound. And so that led to the bacteria going in, and it would kill June 1 week later. On the afternoon of March 4th, 2000, a 40-year-old woman named Ines Ramirez stood in the kitchen of her tiny one-room home, which was deep in the mountains of Oaxaca, Mexico. Ines had a whole chicken on the counter right in front of her that she had just killed and plucked, and now she was using a 6-inch-long knife to butcher it for their dinner. And as she did this, every once in a while, she would look out the window to check on her 7 kids who were playing together out in the yard. So Ines and her large family lived in a very isolated rural community of about maybe 500 people. They didn't have running water or electricity or a phone, and they lived miles away from their closest neighbors. They mainly lived off of corn and vegetables that they grew themselves, chickens they raised, and then wild animals that Ines's husband would catch. Her husband was actually gone that day because he was out in the mountains hunting for deer. And so as Ines is just kind of going about her fairly typical evening routine here, making dinner, she suddenly felt this really intense, very painful cramping sensation that was kind of ripping through her abdomen. And it hurt so bad that Enos stopped what she was doing and kind of doubled over and grabbed the counter and just tried to steady her breathing. I mean, this was really shocking. And for about a minute, Enos just stood there, holding onto the counter, just waiting for this pain to pass, and eventually it did. And once it eased up, it was like, okay, she was back to normal and she could stand up again. But this was sort of alarming. But at the same time, Enos was used to dealing with basically all medical crises on her own. They lived in this isolated part of the world, and the nearest medical clinic was 50 miles away, and they didn't have a car. So, like anything that happened, they basically had to deal with it themselves, and that was routine. And so for Enos, despite how incredibly painful this was, she just told herself, like, now that it had passed, the pain was gone, she said, you know what? It's probably fine. Like, I'm good. And so pretty quickly, she just kind of forgot about it and went back to butchering the chicken. But several hours later, this is after midnight now, the pain came right back. And at this point, Enos, she's in this one common room in her house where all her kids are fast asleep. It's past midnight now, and she's sitting on this bench and she's gripping her abdomen, rocking back and forth as this pain just rockets back and forth across her abdomen constantly. There's no relief, nothing. And she's trying so hard not to make a sound because she doesn't want to wake her kids up, nor does she want to scare her kids. Her husband is still off in the mountains hunting for deer, so she is alone. She just has this little flickering candle nearby. That's the only light she's got, and she's just isolated, dealing with this excruciating pain. And so at this point, Enos really felt like this could be a real problem. This might not be something she could just brush off and let pass on its own. This was real. This was an actual emergency. But what can she even do? There's nowhere to go. She can't do anything. She is just completely trapped here with this excruciating pain that's making it hard to even have coherent thought. It's so bad. But the one thought that kept going through her mind was she had to do something, or whatever this was. It felt like it was gonna kill her. And so Enos felt like she really only had one option here, and it was a horrible, horrible option. But she knew she had to do it. And so she got up and she's hunched over in pain, and as quietly as she could, she walked over to a cabinet and she opened it up and she grabbed a small bottle of alcohol and she took a few sips to kind of numb the pain a little bit. And then after she had done that, she turned around and, still with this blinding pain, she hobbled into the kitchen and she grabbed that 6-inch knife she had used earlier to butcher the chicken. And then she walked right back over to the bench near that candle that she'd been sitting on earlier. And once she was there, she reached down and she pulled up her shirt, exposing her abdomen, where this pain was coming from. And then she took the knife and she plunged it into her abdomen. And immediately she let out this blood-curdling scream. She couldn't help it. And she was sort of vaguely aware of all her kids waking up and sort of making their way over to her, but she was so focused on what she was doing, and she began slowly dragging this blade down her abdomen all the way to her belly button. And then she pulled out the knife and she can barely think. It's so painful. Her kids are crying. And then she plunged the knife back into her abdomen and raked it down the other side, creating this massive gash in her stomach. And then she kind of dropped the knife and she's screaming. She can't even help it, and her kids are all crying. And she takes her hand and she reaches into her stomach and she's fishing around. Every little move is like lightning striking her body. But she eventually finds what she's looking for and she pulls it out of her stomach. And what she's looking at is her 8th child, a baby boy. And she had enough wherewithal to take that knife and cut the umbilical cord and place the baby down before she passed out. After Enos lost consciousness, one of her kids left the house and just started running to go find the nearest person to get some help. And miraculously, after finding some people, when those first responders got to the home where Enos was, hours later, they found her and her newborn son alive. And they were taken to the closest hospital for emergency treatment, and they would both make full recoveries. Today, Enos Ramirez is the only woman ever who has performed a successful C-section on herself. In the early morning hours of December 3rd, 1921, A 62-year-old woman named Augusta Roblin lay awake in her bedroom inside of her daughter's house in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Augusta had lived with her daughter now for about a year. She had moved in after her husband had passed away. She just really hated being alone, and at night in particular, it was difficult to sleep sometimes. Just the weight of the loneliness was very intense. And also, Augusta was known to have really visceral bad dreams, and so that, combined with loneliness, made living alone really awful. So here she was, living with her daughter. But on this particular night, Augusta, she was wide awake in bed because she had had one of these awful nightmares, but she knew she could not tell her daughter about it. Now, normally one of the ways that Augusta would cope with these terrible nightmares, even when she was living alone, is she would get in touch with her daughter and they would talk about it. They would try to figure out if there was meaning in this awfulness of these nightmares. And sometimes they felt like they did find deeper meaning, and it sort of was cathartic for Augusta. But on this night, the dream she had just had, this nightmare, this visceral, awful nightmare, she knew, based on what she believed it meant, she absolutely could not tell her daughter anything about it. She had to hide it at all costs. In the dream Augusta had just had, she kind of came to and she was in her daughter's basement. So in the basement of the house she was in right now. And in front of her on the ground were these two perfectly circular, very, very deep holes, just that went straight into the ground. And so Augusta, she found herself walking towards the edge and looking over. And she saw it was like this unbelievable abyss in each hole. It's like it went on into infinity. But despite this innate fear she had for these holes, she sat down on the edge of one of these holes and basically dangled her feet over this, cataclysmic abyss below her. And as she's sitting there like a child dangling her feet, these two men in dark clothes, they wander over out of the shadows and they walk behind Augusta. They don't interact with her, and they go to the other hole, the hole that is next to Augusta. And she looks at these men and they're not looking at her. They're doing something. They're clearly in the middle of some sort of act. And they pull this huge carpet seemingly out of nowhere, and the two men stretch it out over this other hole next to Augusta, and they lay it over the hole. And as soon as Augusta saw that, she suddenly understood what was happening here, and she was horrified. So she woke up. And now here she was, knowing that based on what she just saw in her mind's eye in this horrible nightmare, that she could never share it with anyone, that she would live with the secret. So Augusta would eventually fall back to sleep that night, and she would get up in the morning and she would not tell her daughter, Henrietta, anything about this dream she had had. She played it off like everything was just fine. But over the course of the day, Henrietta, even though she didn't say anything, began to notice that her mom was just acting really weird, like something was on her mind. And finally, at night, when the two of them sat down for dinner, this is basically, 24 hours, give or take, from when Augusta had this dream, right? They're sitting down for dinner, and Augusta, she's not eating, she seems totally disconnected, and she just seems off. And Henrietta's like, "Mom, what is going on with you?" And Augusta, at this point, realized she must be giving off very negative vibes here. And so she told her daughter, "Don't worry, I'm fine, I'm sorry, I'm not hungry. Everything's fine, I'm just feeling a little bit off. So everything's fine." But Henrietta realistically did not believe her mom, but she didn't push her. She said, okay. And they finished their dinner, and then before long, Augusta had gone to bed. But the next morning, when Henrietta got up, she went downstairs expecting to see her mom, but Augusta was nowhere to be found. And so again, feeling kind of concerned about her mom's behavior, she went to Augusta's bedroom to check on her, and she found her mom seeming really weak and lethargic and just totally out of it, laying in bed. And she asked her mom, really, what's going on with you? Are you not feeling well? What's happening here? And her mom just said, I just don't want to get out of bed. I'm feeling under the weather. I'm going to stay here. But even though Henrietta could see her mom was clearly downplaying this, she just felt like there's too many red flags. So she called a doctor. And a doctor came to the house, and a doctor examined Augusta, and they determined that, it wasn't really clear exactly what was going on with her. Clearly she's not feeling great, but the only thing they found was that her heart sounded a little bit weak. And so the doctor suggested that Augusta just, rest, have some water, eat some food, and just stay in bed, and you should get better. But despite Augusta doing what the doctor said and basically remaining on bed rest, she didn't get better. And in fact, Henrietta, her daughter, is watching and she's clearly seeing that not only is her mother deteriorating physically, but she was also becoming more and more despondent and sort of disconnected emotionally. It was like she was drifting off into some other world that Henrietta was not a part of, and she was just so worried about her mom. And so finally, on December 7th, so this is for reference, 5 days after Augusta had that visceral nightmare that she felt like she couldn't share with anybody, Henrietta went into her mother's room and she sat on the edge of the bed and she said to her mom, "You gotta tell me what's going on. It seems like there's something else here that you're not sharing with me. You gotta tell me. I don't care what it is, but I gotta know." Augusta, when she heard her daughter saying this, she sort of thought about trying to keep doing the same thing she was doing, which was, basically say everything's fine and push her daughter off. But she could tell Henrietta was not gonna take that for an answer. And so Augusta sighed and she said, "I had that dream again. Except this time, I watched the procedure." Now, to us, this is, cryptic and weird and doesn't really mean anything. But to Henrietta, who understood what her mom was talking about, she was completely horrified. It would turn out Augusta really did have horrible nightmares that plagued her for at least the last year or so. But it was like a recurring nightmare. She didn't have different variations. It basically was the exact same nightmare that just really upset her. The way it went is, she would open her eyes in this nightmare, and in front of her would be these two bottomless pits, these huge holes in the ground. Now, she wouldn't know what these holes are, but she'd be able to tell that she was in an environment that she recognized. One time she saw that she was in her sister-in-law's garden. Another time she saw she was in her neighbor's backyard. She knew where she was, but she didn't understand these holes. But in this nightmare, she would always walk up to the holes, and then she, not two men who walked in, but she would take a rug out and cover up one of those holes, and then she'd wake up. Now, on its face, this does not sound like a particularly frightening dream. But there's a connection to the real world that made it frightening. Every time Augusta would have these nightmares, the person who lived at the property where the dream took place, the sister-in-law's garden, the neighbor's backyard, when she would have that dream, she would come to, and then within a couple of days, that person would die, usually inexplicably. It was like a harbinger of doom that these dreams represented who was gonna die next. And so every time she had this dream, she knew someone's gonna die. But in that last dream she had, the one, 5 days earlier that scared her so badly, she knew she couldn't tell Henrietta. In that dream, it was the first time she, Augusta, didn't perform the procedure, i.e. putting the rug over one of the holes. Those two men came over and they did it. And Augusta realized she's sitting with her feet in the other hole, and she's realizing she's in her daughter's basement. That's where this dream's taking place. This must mean she, Augusta, is next. And wouldn't you know it, just days after telling her daughter about this, within 2 weeks of having this dream, Augusta died of heart failure in her daughter's house. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.